video in the series on the Moedim of YaHuWaH, the appointed times of YaHuWaH. In this video series, we are going to cover all of YaHuWaH's festival days and all of his appointed times, and we are going to look at their prophetic implications in the past, in the present, and in the future, in the world that is to come, the Malkut, or the reign or kingdom of YaHuWaH our Elohim, when he sets his Malkut, his reign, his kingdom on the earth, and we preach and proclaim that day with eagerness and with boldness. It is very important to understand YaHuWaH's festival days, to understand his prophetic time clock, to understand the prophetic mysteries in which he is embedded into these rehearsals, the Kodesh Mikra, the set-apart gatherings that he has decreed in the Torah. There is a reason that these festivals have been recorded in the Word of YaHuWaH, and it is our job as the children of the Most High to seek out these revelations and to teach them to the people so that they better understand YaHuWaH our Elohim before he comes to judge this earth. We are going to begin this study in a very familiar piece of passage for those of you who observe the Torah. This is in Leviticus, Vayikra, chapter 23. And this is the subject text. And I would prefer if you would actually study over this chapter on your own and do your own prayers and investigating to the festivals of YaHuWaH. This is an excellent chapter to look at. We're going to look at the very first verse in Leviticus Vayikra, chapter 23. And it reads, "And YaHuWaH spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Yasharel, and say to them, the appointed times, the Moedim of YaHuWaH, which you are to proclaim." The word proclaim there is kara, which means to preach and proclaim, as set apart gatherings, or Kodesh Mikra, which means a sanctified or set apart or special and pure gathering or rehearsal. The word mikra also gets its root from kara, which also means something that is to be preached and to be professed and proclaimed. So these are declarations, the set apart declarations, the set apart gatherings. The King James renders this a holy convocation. Now, the word holy has very many pagan connotations, but that word, that abstract term that is used in Christianity today, actually beneath the surface of that word, if we go back into the Hebrew, we get the word Kodesh. The word Kodesh means something that is pure, it is set apart unto YaHuWaH. My appointed times, my Moedim. Notice YaHuWaH makes the declaration that these appointed times are not the appointed times of Yasharel or Israel, nor does he say they are the appointed times of the Yahudim or what people call the Jews. But rather he says these are his Moedim. These are his appointed times. Okay, it says, my appointed times, my Moedim are these. 6 days work is done, but the seventh day. Now this word seventh day is going to be extremely important in this teaching. You are going to hear me reference it over and over. And you have to understand what this means in the Hebrew. It is the phrase Yom HaShabba'i, which means Yom, day or movement, HaShabba'i of the seventh day. You will always see a reference to Yom HaShabba'i, the seventh day, and the word Shabbat, which is Sabbath, as spoken in English. 6 days work is done, but the seventh day, Yom HaShabba'i, is Shabbat. It is the Sabbath of rest. Shabbat Shabbaton, Sabbath of rest. A Kodesh Mikra, a set apart, sanctified, pure rehearsal or calling or proclaiming or declaration that is to happen. It says, you do no work It is a Sabbath, a Shabbat to YaHuWaH in all your dwellings. Now, this one verse is so just packed full of vital information for our own growing of binah or understanding. Because if we were to look at what is exactly going on in the Exodus story, the story of the children of Yasharel, Israel, coming out of the house of bondage, which is today called Egypt, then was called Mizraim, as they make their journey out, YaHuWaH gives us great detail and revelation about these observances of these special times as they are reinstituted here. And if we were to understand that when the children of Yasharel were in their slavery, in their hardships in Mitzrayim, and that when they came out of bondage as led by YaHuWaH by his mighty right hand, and the pouring out of the 10 plagues that came upon the land that is called Egypt today, or Mitzrayim, when we look at this, we see that there were Mitzrayites, or what people would call Egyptians, that left the land with Yasharel or Israel to observe a great festival unto YaHuWaH. This is what was said often when you read, when Moshe was speaking to Pharaoh, he says that there is a sacrifice that must be done, there is a festival that we must hold to YaHuWaH our Elohim. And the Mitzrayites or Egyptians that come out. So when it says here, and we're going to further prove this, of course, as we're going to prove many things, but it says that it is a Sabbath, a Shabbat of rest in all of your dwellings. And I'm going to show how the Shabbat was a gift to mankind. It was a gift to all of Yasharel to be a sign, but originally it was given in the very beginning. So to further prove this, we should go to the very beginning. We'll go to Genesis, what we call Bereshith, in a beginning, and we're going to start in chapter 2. And we read in chapter 2, verse 1 in the Hebrew, or Abrit, it says, وَيَكَلُوا هَشَمَيِّم وَهَآرِتْ وَقَاسْ زَبَام. Now, we're going to look at this in English. It says, وَيَكَلُوا, and he finished, Hashamayim, the heavens or the space, وَهَآرِتْ, and the land, وَقَاسْ زَبَام, and all its host. That word Zabam is very interesting because that word Sabam gives us the same word that we use when we call YaHuWaH Sabaot, or what has been called YaHuWaH of hosts, YaHuWaH of the armies. This word can be used to imply the stars, the planets, the sun, the moon, these various signs that are in the Shamayim, but it is also used for the messengers of YaHuWaH, the Malakim of YaHuWaH, which have erroneously been referred to as angels and been depicted as females with wings and halos. These are completely not what the scriptures show us. These are completely pagan, idolatrous images and concepts. But what we're talking about are the messengers. So right here we even have a hint to the very creation of the messengers. Verse 2, وَيَقَالْ Elohim bayom hashabe'i melakto asher asah وَيَشَبَّat bayom hashabe'i mikal melakto asher asah. In English we see وَيَقَالْ, it means and his all, Elohim bayom hashabe'i. Elohim, as in the mighty one, it's in the plural. People sometimes would say mighty ones. YaHuWaH says he is one. He is achad, he's united. He is one. He is not 2 or 3. He is not 4 or 5 or 6 or 1,000. YaHuWaH is one, okay? It is in the plural form because of YaHuWaH's infinite existence. He is Haya Asher Haya, I am that I am, the self-existing one, YaHuWaH Elohim. And when it says Bayom HaShabe'i, it is saying in the day of the seventh day. Remember, Yom HaShabe'i is very important throughout this entire teaching. Milakto, the work of him, or his work, literally. Now we get this word from Melaka, which is also where we get the word for malak or messenger, also where the root for king comes from. And when we do a study on this word, what we will find is melakto, his work, refers to his sovereign creative work. It has to do with his plans. It has to do with what a lot of people will refer to as his business, so to speak. And we see here that this is forbidden on the Shabbat, but we see here that YaHuWaH, we're going to see that he is going to rest from this particular type of work. Now, when I'm talking about this particular type of work, now this is not quite what you would think of. This word would not explain, like working outside in the sunshine. Perhaps that would be more like a bulada, which means like servant work or hard labor. Okay, this is referring to any of our personal business. This would eliminate the ability, for example, for you to be able to like sign contracts or fill out papers and deeds that refer to your own creative works and things like that. Doesn't require any sweat, it just requires the fact that you are exerting your power, as YaHuWaH was exerting his power to create and to complete your own businesses, your own works and labors. Okay? When it says here, Asher Asa, that means which he's doing. So, we see that, and all of Elohim's work is going to be finished on this Yom HaShabba'i, the work which he's doing, Asher Asa. Now, when you read in your King James Version, it's going to say the work which he did. However, this is not quite accurate enough, because what it really is implying is that he is still working. The work which he does, Asher Asa, the work which he's doing and the work which he does. It's important because the very next phrase is YaHuWaH. Wa on the wall in the beginning of a word just means and. But the next phrase here is YaShabbat. YaShabbat means literally he Shabbat, or he rested. However, with the yod on front of the Shabbat, the yad, the hand of YaHuWaH, it refers to YaHuWaH, YaShabbat. The short form of YaHuWaH's name is Yah. We have here YaShabbat. So who was the first to celebrate the Sabbath or observe the Shabbat? It was YaHuWaH Elohim. It was not the children of Israel or Yasharel. That is why in the passage previously we read, when YaHuWaH said, "These are my Moedim." YaHuWaH owns these Moedim. These are his. They're attributed to him and him alone. And he rested. And he celebrated Sabbath. And he Shabbat. But Yom HaShabba'i, in the seventh day, in Yom HaShabba'i. This Yom HaShabba'i is interchangeable with Shabbat throughout the scriptures. Always you will see the phrase Yom HaShabba'i. Now in English, we just say, the seventh day. That doesn't really matter. What's the big deal? The big deal is that in the Hebrew language, this is a description that is tied directly into the concept and idea with Shabbat. And we're going to look at that in just a moment. We look at the very phonetics of Shabbat. If we continue on, it reads, Mikal Melakto Asher Asa, from all Melakto, his work, his creative power, all these different things, which he's doing. So literally, what we have here is that, and he completed all of his work on the seventh day, which he's doing. And he rested, and he Shabbat, YaShabbat, on the seventh day, the day of the Shabbat, from all of his melakto, from all of his labors and works and plans, which he's doing, Asher Asa. Barak Elohim et Yom HaShabba'i, Kodesh Oto, Ki bo Shabbat Mikal Melakto Asher bara Elohim la'asot. What does that mean in English? Probably the most important revelation about the Sabbath or the Shabbat in all the scriptures. Next to the fact of what we just read, that it was Yahu Shabbat. It was YaHuWaH who celebrated Sabbath first. Because here it says, YaHuWaH Elohim et Yom HaShabbat. In English we would simply say, or in your King James Version maybe I should say, the Christians write, and he blessed, and Elohim blessed the seventh day. Now that word blessed is very, very, very abstract. Again, it has pagan connotations, just like that word holy does in the Christian vernacular. But if we look beneath the surface, we can come to a very concrete meaning of this word, which has been deemed blessed. This word barak has a very deep implication. It means to bend the knee, as in giving a gift. So the reason this is important is in the previous verse in the Hebrew we read that YaShabbat. Now we are reading that not only did he Shabbat, but now he is giving the Shabbat as a gift. You miss that completely in the English language. There's no way to capture that properly when you use words like blessed. It's impossible. But when you go beneath the surface, you see that YaShabbat, he gave the Sabbath, he's the first one, and he gives it as a gift. But further it reads, Barak Elohim et. Elohim et is huge, just those two words. We've already talked about Elohim. Elohim is the plural word for Eloah, which refers to the Most High, the Mighty One, the Infinite One, okay? But here we see it specifically beside the first and the last letter in the Hebrew language, the Abrit language. It is the Aleph and the Taw. And the Aleph and the Taw represent the range of letters used in the Hebrew scriptures to create all things seen and unseen. The Creator spoke all things into existence. He spoke through the Lashon Kodesh, through the set-apart tongue, and that set-apart tongue is today referred to as Hebrew and Abrit and Yahudit. But this originally was the Lashon Kodesh, the set-apart tongue, which is also called Lashon Ish, the tongue of fire. All right? YaHuWaH created with this, using the range of letters Aleph through Taw, and he made all things by his word. This is important because we know that the Aleph and Taw is a place designator grammatically in the scriptures. That's what they call it. However, we know that there is a much deeper meaning. The deeper meaning implies it is the Messiah himself, the first and the last, who is with Elohim. If we read the very first line in Bereshith or Genesis, instead of just saying that in the beginning Elohim created the heavens and the earth, we read Bereshith bara Elohim et. In a beginning, Elohim created Aleph Taw. He brought forth Aleph Taw. And then it says the heavens and Aleph Taw, the earth. It's very important to understand these revelations. Here, the Aleph Taw is between the revelation of Elohim and the revelation of Yom HaShabbat, the seventh day. The seventh day cannot be removed from the Messiah. The Messiah is the master of the Shabbat. And therefore, we see it reflected in the Hebrew language right here. And Yah gave as a gift Elohim Aleph Taw, the Yom of the seventh day. YaKodesh Oto. Now, in the King James, again, I keep referencing the King James. A lot of people use that version. I don't like to use that version. I like to get back into the Hebrew altogether. However, in your King James version or most of your English versions, what you're going to read, and he made it holy. Whoa, you couldn't get further from the actual revelation than just that simple phrase. That is completely on like a different, wavelength of what is being said here. What is being said here is deep, it is pure, it comes from the very utterance of YaHuWaH Elohim on high. And what he says here, when he says YaHuWaH Kodesh Oto, first of all, Kodesh, we talked about this. Kodesh means set apart, pure. It means something that is sanctified. People would say sacred, these different things. Of course, those words have pagan connotations. But these are words that would spark the idea of Kodesh. It is something that is pure. It is valuable to YaHuWaH Elohim. It is a virtue of YaHuWaH Elohim. And what he says here is he sets apart. That's what Kodesh can mean, set apart. And Yah set apart. Oto doesn't mean it. It doesn't just mean it, like it's translated, where it says, and he made it holy. That's not what this means. Oto comes from the word oath. Oto means his sign. Oath means sign, and it is spelled with the aleph and the ta, except in this place, it is pronounced slightly different for a wall that should be between them, and we pronounce it and utter it as oath. Here, the aleph and the ta is vital. The Messiah is vital to the revelation of the Sabbath and the setting apart of the Sabbath. However, we see much more. We see not only did YaHuWaH Elohim give the Shabbat, but he gave it to be a gift and a sign. A sign, an oath. That's what that word means, a sign. Ki bo Shabbat, in it, the Sabbath, mikol, from all milakto, his labors and works and business, asher, which bara, creating, Elohim la'asot, was doing. So he rested from all the works which he was doing. In the English, it just simply reads, from the Scriptures version, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their array. And on the seventh day, Elohim completed his work which he had done, and he rested, or YaShabbat, on the seventh day, Yom HaShabba'i, from all his work which he had made. And Elohim barak the seventh day, and made it Kodesh, or set it apart, because on it he rested from all his work which Elohim in creating had made. Now, in English, of course, we get the general idea. But in the Hebrew, again, we note that it was Yah who first kept the Sabbath. He gave it as a gift. He made it a Kodesh sign, a special, sanctified, set apart sign between him and his creation. The giving of the Sabbath gives us an insight into the very heart and mind of the infinite one, the Kodesh one, Baruch is he, YaHuWaH Elohim, and it shows us that he is concerned for his creation. He does not want his creation to overexert themselves. He does not want his creation to toil and trouble all of his days on the earth. He wants his creation to enjoy a time of rest. Not only does he want his creation to enjoy a time of rest, but apparently he wants his creation to reflect himself. After all, we read that he made Adam in his Selmenu, his likeness, and his Demuthnu, his image, after his image. And then he gives Adam, the very first man who's created on the sixth day, the gift of the seventh day, the Sabbath, the Shabbat. After all, we read that Yah barak, and he barak, and he bent and gave a gift. Who did he give that gift to? He gave that gift to his creation. He gave that gift to Adam and to his descendants after him. We know that the righteous men, the Tzaddikim of the Scriptures, they knew the way of YaHuWaH, the Derech YaHuWaH. They knew his Torah. They observed these precepts and they observed these principles. We see, if we look at the life of Cain and Hebel, Cain and Abel, Hebel knew that it would please Elohim to give him a slaughter offering of a clean animal, a Kodesh gift unto YaHuWaH. How could he possibly know this? He knew this by revelation through the Ruach YaHuWaH, through the wind and breath of YaHuWaH himself. What people call the Spirit of YaHuWaH. Revealed this to Hebel. We go on further. The seventh man from Adam, his name was Hanuk or Enoch. It says, again, the number 7 is so important in the scriptures. It's so beautiful and amazing in the scriptures because he represents the Sabbath man, the Shabbat man. He is the Shabbat, the seventh. And it reads, when we read about his life, it says that he pleased Elohim in such a way that he was no longer found on the earth, for Elohim himself had taken him. We further read about many of his revelations in the books of Hanuk and Enoch, which are called Enoch in English. If we look at the 10th man, the man that many people have heard about all of their lives, the man that we call Noah, which means a rest, Noah, or Noah. We know that when he was preparing the ark, that YaHuWaH gave him by inspiration through the very Dabar YaHuWaH, the word of YaHuWaH himself, that he was to take upon the ark 7 pairs of clean animals and only a pair of the unclean animals. Yet the revelation of clean and unclean, as far as Western Christianity and the Western mindset goes, all their theological works, they don't even think that Noah would have known this because the revelation didn't come until the giving of Torah by Moshe or Moses. But we know that this is not completely accurate because these men, these righteous men, did what pleased YaHuWaH. They knew the clean from the unclean. They knew what was Kodesh versus what was profane. And surely Noah knew this because when he gets off the ark, what does he do? He begins to take those clean animals and he offers up sacrifice to YaHuWaH, our Elohim. Later we read of the patriarch Abraham, who was first called Abram. And we see that it is written concerning Abraham that Abraham kept the Torah, which is plural for Torah. He kept YaHuWaH's teachings, he kept his laws, he kept his statutes. But we know for a certainty that this Abraham was the father of Yitzhak, who was the father of Yaakov, who was later called Yasharel, which is being called Israel. And from him comes the 12 tribes of Israel. And we know that Moses the prophet, was of the sons of Levi, of the tribe of Levi. And so is his brother Aharon. We know that Moshe did not give Torah until much, much, much later. Abraham already knew Torah by a direct revelation from the Dabar YaHuWaH, the word of YaHuWaH. So we know that these men understood the Torah before it was even given, written down. YaHuWaH wrote with his own fingers on the tablets of stone, but before he wrote those precepts, Abraham knew the precepts. Before he wrote them on tablets of stone, Adam, who walked with YaHuWaH in the garden, he would have known the precepts. It's very important to know these things. The number 7 is such an interesting number. I mean, we see it really in every culture as a very special number. It happens to be in most cultures that just about every culture that you really observe, their literal week will have 7 days. There are 7 colors in the rainbow, for instance. The rainbow was a sign between YaHuWaH and Noah to be a sign between them forever. It is written that the rainbow, the bow itself, is the bow of YaHuWaH. And we read that it surrounds his throne. Again, he gives this, showing us the importance of the number 7. In many cultures, you will hear people say that 7 is what they call a lucky number. Of course, we don't believe in luck because luck is happen chance. We don't believe in this. We believe in the giving and taking away of YaHuWaH. That YaHuWaH gives, YaHuWaH takes away. Okay? So we don't believe in happen chance. We don't believe in these things, but we look at the different cultures, they do, and they think that it is a special number. We see this number in Fibonacci sequences in the creation, embedded in the creation itself. We see that this number is reflected in the continents on the earth and reflected in what were called the seven seas and the seven classical planets. Once upon a time, a planet did not have the same definition that it has today. The sun and the moon were seen as planets. Anything that was not affixed in the celestial sky, meaning anything that moved about on what seemed to be its own way, was seen to be a planet. And in the Roman culture, they call the Sabbath day, the Shabbat, they call it the day of Saturn because, of course, it is a pagan word. Of course, it reflects a pagan deity because the nations worship the sun, the moon, the stars. They worship these things. They worship the objects of creation, but they do not worship the Creator, YaHuWaH. But in so naming this day or part of this day, after Saturn, they reflected the idea of the seventh classical planet, showing that truly they believed and connected it with the number 7. If we look at astronomy and astrology of old, that the Hebrews knew and the words that they used to describe the planets, you will see that that planet is not called Saturn. In the Hebrew language, it is called Shabbat, because it is the 7th and it is a picture of the Sabbath rest. Even Josephus Flavius mentions the correlation between the 7 classical planets and the 7-day perpetual week that is given. In over 100 dialects of language, we see a correlation between the Shemitic Hebrew word Shabbat and the 7th day in other calendars and other cultures. For instance, in Greek, this word is called Sabaton. That is the word for the Shabbat. Sabaton. That's not even a Greek word. The very concept comes from the Hebrew speakers. If we look at the Spanish word for what is called today as the 7th day, they call it Sabado. If you look at in the Arabic language, in the Islamic calendar, first let me explain something about why this is important. The Islamic calendar has absolutely nothing to do with the true scriptural calendar. It is purely a lunar-based calendar, other than its weeks, which are a chain and a cycle of 7s, which reflects the truth. And on the 7th day, the day that we call Shabbat, the Sabbath, in Arabic, which is a sister language to the Hebrew tongue, they call it Assabat, but the Muslims do not keep the Sabbath. Why is this important? Because now you have another group who is also identifying the reality that the 7th day is the Shabbat and that they also know when it is, but they don't observe it. They observe the 6th day. It's very important. We see in Portuguese it's called Sabado. In Polish it's called Sabado. In Turkish it's called Yom Assabat. In Malay Arya is called Sabtu, and Abyssinian is Sanbat, Bohemia is Sabato, Bulgarian Subato, and Coptic is P Sabaton. In Ethiopic is Sanbat. All of these words sound so similar to Shabbat and Sabbath. We see that the other nations know. They know. How would they know? Well, if we were to observe in the scriptures, we know that Adam knew the creation week as, of course, he was a part of it. He was created on the 6th day. YaHuWaH rests on the 7th day from the work which he's doing, implying that YaHuWaH keeps the Shabbat himself every 7th day. He acknowledges the Shabbat himself every 7th day. So therefore, the next week in Adam's life, he would have known the Sabbath. And it would have been passed on down through the generations. And of course, we know that Noah, who pleased Elohim, and his very name means a rest. We know that he knew when the Sabbath was, when the Shabbat was. And it was only a few generations after the man called Noah in the English that we see that there was erected a tower called Migdal Babel in Hebrew, or Tower of Babel in English. And it was at this tower that was created and erected by Nimrod that this tower was to reach into the Shemayim to show that the creation had now become like the Creator. And of course, there is much more to the story. But what you need to know is Elohim confused their language. That's why it was called Babel. It means confusion and mixture. Babel, as in even today when we say someone is babbling, it means they are not making sense. They're rambling. But it was here that the ideas that were in the culture were dispersed into the four corners of the earth and taken into other languages. And of course, these men would have known the Shabbat. They would have known these principles because they would later be taught by righteous men like Abraham, righteous men like Yitzhak and Yaakov, righteous men like Moshe, righteous men like Jeremiah, who's called Jeremiah, and Yeshayahu, who is Isaiah, the prophets of old. The Sabbath is one of the most important revelations ever given. We know that the Shabbat, for a fact, has been preserved for us to know the exactness of its time. We know that it is important that Yahuwah's people in the final days and the final hours will be observing the ancient Shabbat that was given originally as a gift to mankind, but later reinstituted through the wedding vows that were given to the nation of Yasharel, which is called Israel. We must guard the Sabbath. We must diligently watch over it and keep it throughout our generations. We've been commanded to. And we know when it is. It begins on the Roman calendar and what is called Friday night, or the evening of the sixth day, because we don't like to use these pagan words. When we are speaking to believers, we never call days Friday. We never say those because it comes from Frigga, a pagan goddess. And I use that word goddess for the pagan things, but Yahuwah is never called by these words, G-O-D or any of those things. Yahuwah is special. He is Kodesh. The way of the heathen is polluted, and it is vile to Yahuwah. But on the day of the sixth day in the evening, all the way until the evening of the seventh day, which has been deemed on the Roman calendar Saturn's day, but deemed on the Islamic calendar as Sabbat, deemed on the Jewish calendar as the Sabbath, deemed on the Ethiopic calendar in Ethiopia, which claims that it has a 2,000-year-old cycle of sevens from the scriptural times. They call it Sanbat, which means Sabbath or Shabbat. Not just in a handful of cultures, not just in a Roman culture, not just in the Ethiopic culture, not just in all these different places. We see it in Asia. We see it all over the earth. A special record so that Yahuwah would know that we are to keep His Sabbath. And we're to keep it from evening to evening. There are some that have come along who try to say this is untrue. They have no idea because they are not truly studying in the Hebrew. When we read in the Hebrew in Genesis, Bereshit chapter 1, every single day we see the phrase in English, and there was evening and there was morning the first day, and there was evening and morning the second day. In Hebrew, what is important here is there's more that is being said. It says, YaHuWaH Erev, YaHuWaH Boker, Yom Achad. This is so important. YaHuWaH means and it exists. And it exists the evening, showing a chronology of events. There was the evening and existed the evening. YaHuWaH Boker, and then existed the morning. Yom Achad, or Yom United is what Achad can mean. It also means day one, first day. But here, the very first day gives us the construct to show us that has to be the evening and there has to be the morning for a completion of the Yom cycle. Now, I know there are those who point out that Yahuwah created the greater light. And when there is the greater light, when He separates the day from the night, that He calls the day Yom and He calls the night Laila. So there are those who say that the Yom is a separate 12-hour period there is so much that you're missing in the scriptures. There's so much that you're missing in the Hebrew. If you do a study on Yom, you will see oftentimes it has a 24-hour connotation, such as in Vayikra Leviticus 23:32. From evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Shabbat. In the evening, at the going down of the sun. That's in Deuteronomy 16, verse 6. So we know that these events, the days begin in the evening at the going down of the sun. Now let us go to Shemoth, or Exodus, in chapter 16 and begin in verse 10. And now we will read the example of the re-giving of the Sabbath, the Shabbat, to the nation of Yasharel in the wilderness. We're going to start in chapter 16, verse 10. But before I begin, I have to point out an important thing. First of all, it has been implied by many that the Sabbath was reconstituted at Mount Sinai at the giving of the Ten Commandments. However, this is not correct. The children of Yasharel began to keep the Shabbat before the revelation that YaHuWaH gave through the 10 words, which we call the 10 commands many times. If we read in chapter 16, verse 10, we will get a full view of the Sabbath and many, many revelations. It says in verse 10, and it came to be, as Aharon, or Aaron, spoke to all the congregation of Bnei Yisrael, or the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness and see the kabod YaHuWaH, the esteem of YaHuWaH's special word there, kabod. It requires a very special study all of its own. But the kabod is a manifestation of YaHuWaH himself, appearing in the cloud. And YaHuWaH spoke to Moshe, saying, I have heard the grumblings of the children of Yasharel. Speak to them, saying, between the evenings you are to eat meat, and in the boker, in the morning, you are to be satisfied with lechem, with bread. And you shall know that I am YaHuWaH, your Elohim. When YaHuWaH wants to emphasize something, he will proclaim himself and proclaim the power of his name. Oftentimes you hear YaHuWaH make a statement, and after he makes the statement, he will say, I am YaHuWaH, or I am YaHuWaH, your Elohim, emphasizing the power of the statement that is being made. And it came to be that quails came up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the boker, the dew lay all around the camp. And the layer of dew went up, and see, on the surface of the wilderness was a small, round substance, as fine as frost on the ground. And the children of Yasharel saw, and they said to each other, what is it? Or manna. What is it? Manna. For they did not know what it was. And Moshe said to them, it is the bread, the lechem, which YaHuWaH has given you to eat. This is the dabar, the word which YaHuWaH has commanded. He is now showing us that the bread is a commandment. It is the word of YaHuWaH. Let every man gather it according to each one's need, an omer for each being according to the number of beings. Let every man take for those who are in his tent. And the children of Yasharel did so, and gathered some more and some less. And they measured it by omers. And he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Each one gathered according to his need. And Moshe said, let no one leave of it until the morning. And they did not listen to Moshe, so some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moshe was angry with them. And they gathered it every morning, each one according to his need. And when the sun became hot, it melted. And it came to be on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moshe. And he said to them, this is what YaHuWaH has said. Tomorrow is a rest, a Shabbat, Kodesh LeYaHuWaH, set apart and special and pure unto YaHuWaH. Kodesh LeYaHuWaH. That which you bake, bake. And that which you cook, cook. And lay up for yourselves all that is left over to keep until the boker, the morning. And they did, and they laid it up until morning, as Moshe commanded, and it did not stink, and no worm was in it. And Moshe said, eat it today, for today is a Shabbat, YaHuWaH, Sabbath unto YaHuWaH. Today you do not find it in the field. Gather it 6 days, but on the 7th day, which is the Shabbat, there is none. And it came to be that some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, but they found none. And YaHuWaH said to Moshe, how long shall you refuse to guard my commands and my Torot? See, because YaHuWaH has given you the Shabbat, therefore he is giving you bread for 2 days on the 6th day. Let each one stay in his place. Do not let anyone go out of his place on Yom HaShabbat, which is now again intertwined specifically to show us that Yom HaShabbat is the Sabbath day, the 7th day. So the people rested on Yom HaShabbat, which again is interchangeable with the phrase HaShabbat, the Sabbath. And the house of Yisrael called its name manna. And it was like white coriander seed. And the taste of it was like thin cakes made with honey. And Moshe said, this is the word which YaHuWaH has commanded. Fill an omer with it to keep for all your generations, so they see the bread which I fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you out of the land of Mitzrayim. And Moshe said to Aharon, take a pot and put an omer of manna in it, and set it down before YaHuWaH to keep for your generations. As YaHuWaH commanded Moshe, so did Aharon set it down before the witness to keep. And the children of Yisrael ate manna 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is 1/10 of an ephah. This passage gives us a dynamic, a huge revelation for those who have eyes to see it and ears to hear it. First, there are those who have attacked the Sabbath day in recent times. They have claimed that no man can truly know when the Sabbath day is, or they say things like, well, I think we should calculate it by this method, or I think we should calculate it by that method. However, as I said before, the Sabbath has never been truly erased from the memory of history. In fact, it has a huge impact and shows the creative power and omnipotence of YaHuWaH Elohim, who has guarded the Shabbat and preserved it for generations and generations, because it is to be observed for generation unto generation. If we look at the words here and we examine them closely, what YaHuWaH shows us as the great revelation of Sabbath, the first revelation, is first, he ties in the idea and concept of bread, feeding the people and tying in the Sabbath. What's going to happen in 6 days? You're going to go out and you're going to gather your manna. And on the 6th day, you're going to get a double portion of manna, which is very prophetic and all in itself. You're going to get a double portion, and it's going to last you through the Sabbath, through the Shabbat. If you go out on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat, and you look for manna, there's going to be none there. And this was the sign that repeated for 40 years. In other words, if you do the math, you will see that YaHuWaH did this every day for 40 years. That means the 52 weeks in a year, this is the method that was used. If you multiply that times 40, you will see how many times you will see that YaHuWaH fed his people. And the only pattern that he used for those 40 years in giving them the same spiritual bread from the heavens, from the Shemayim, was that you would count 6 days, and on the 7th day, Yom HaShabbat, there will be no bread. Now, this is why this is important. In the Hebrew language, Sheva is how we pronounce 7. Sheva. It is spelled Shin Beit Ayin in the Hebrew Abrit language. This word Sheva gives us the very word for week, which is Shabua. We insert the YaHuWaH, and suddenly what happens is this root word Sheva takes on a new meaning, a new life of its own, and now it means week. The idea of 7 and week are fundamentally interwoven, not just into the scriptures themselves and the idea in the scriptures, but rather into the DNA of creation. The Hebrew language, the Abrit language, was used to make and fasten the worlds and all that is seen and unseen. And YaHuWaH identified the revelation of 7 with the letters Shin, Bet, Ayin, Sheba. This is how he expresses the idea that we call 7. And in the Hebrew language, if you would learn a little, you would learn very quickly in learning some of the language that the Hebrew language is based off the concept of a root system, meaning that you will get words out of 2 or 3 letters, and that those words would take on additional vowels that would offset and change slightly the revelation of the word itself, but that they are referred to as parent and child roots. They are seen as being one from the same tree. You cannot remove the concept of Sheva, of 7, and the concept of Shabuah, week. No matter what anybody may tell you, if they tell you that the Sabbath could be on the 8th day, for instance, Yom Shemoni, the 8th day, or the 9th day, Yom Tesha, no way, can't be. If they tell you that there will be 2 work days this week, and then we're going to have a Sabbath because we're using the moon to figure out when our Shabbat, our Sabbath is. This is nonsense. This comes from people who do not have a proper understanding of the Hebrew scriptures. They do not have a proper understanding of the revelation of the Sabbath. Steer clear of individuals who are teaching against the Sabbath. Expect in these last times to see all the righteousness and truth of the scriptures to be challenged. Expect it and do not go with it just because someone challenges it. Do not constantly seek the flavor of the month, but go to the ancient paths. Again, focusing on the idea of Sheva, Shin, Bet, Ayin. Insert the YaHuWaH, again, we get week, Shabuah. If we insert the Ta at the end, we get Shabuot. Shabuot happens to be the word for weeks. But why is this important? This is important because one of our festival days is called Shabuot. It is the Feast of Weeks. The Christians in their translations have referred to this day as the Pentecost. The count of 50 is the literal meaning. Because when we read about how to observe Shavuot, which we will, of course, cover in a little bit, slightly in this video, and obviously way more on the video about Shavuot, what we read is to calculate Shavuot, you must count 7 completed Sabbaths. And then the morrow after, the day after, will give you 50 days. That is why the Greeks and the Romans referred to this festival as Pentecost. But we refer to it as Shabuot, which means literally 7s or weeks. If we take that word Sheba once again, and we drop the ayin off the end, and we add the letter Ta, we now have the Hebrew word Shabbat. The word Shabbat is fundamentally interwoven into, again, the DNA of creation, the Hebrew language, which was first revealed by the great I Am that I Am himself. He has interwoven this not just by scripture, not just by saying the 7th day, Yom HaShabba'i, you should rest, but rather also in the very wording and writing of the words in the Hebrew language. That you can never remove the vision and reality of Sheba from Shabbat. You could never take the idea of the 7 and remove it from the Sabbath. So if anybody tells you ever that the Sabbath should be on first day, they're wrong. It is not on the day of the sun that the Romans call. That is the pagan day of worship that the Christians observe because of Emperor Constantine. We'll talk about that later. If they say that it's on the 2nd day, perhaps because they have some lunar calculation, then they are wrong. If they say it's on the 8th day, they defy YaHuWaH. YaHuWaH said Yom HaShabbat, the 7th day. It's a beautiful, beautiful revelation. It's embedded in the Hebrew language. I rejoice in YaHuWaH because He has taken these things which many men who focus on earthly wisdom, earthly chokhmah, which is devilish, is what the scriptures teach. It comes from Shaitan. They try to take this and apply it to the Dabar YaHuWaH, the word of YaHuWaH. And they do it through English translations, and they miss what is beneath the surface. My prayer goes out to all of you who are going down these roads. I hope that you make teshuvah, which is repentance, or returning to YaHuWaH, and keep the only Sabbath that YaHuWaH has ever kept and ever observed. In Shemoth, Exodus, in chapter 20, we read in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to make it Kodesh. It is interesting that one of the most controversial commandments in the scriptures, which many have said, no, we don't have to keep, or hey, I got another day for you over here. The most controversial time in the scriptures seems to be the Sabbath. We're going to read about how controversial the Sabbath is in the scriptures soon. But the most controversial, the one that people want you to forget, is the very one that in English it begins with the word remember. That word comes from the Hebrew zakar. That word zakar means way more than just remember. It means memorialize, as in making a monument. Now, when the heathens want to make a memorial or a monument, they might get a large stone and some chisels, and they make an image, a graven work to what they call their mighty ones. Or they may make it out of wood or gold. They may make it 60 feet in the air or 1,000 feet. They may make it reach all the way to the heavens like the Tower of Babel. However, this does not reflect YaHuWaH. This does not reflect His way. YaHuWaH has given us a very prescribed method to worship Him, to honor Him. It does not matter what the heathens do. It does not matter what they think in their mind. When YaHuWaH says that we are to memorialize the Sabbath, He is not saying that I want you to make a graven image that looks like me and bow down. No. He is saying you take that time, the time frame from evening to evening, which is my completed Sabbath. You take that time and you make it a memorial. You make it a memorial by keeping it, by observing it, by treating it as it is special and unique. This is how you make it a memorial. This is how you remember the Sabbath. Remember the Shabbat day to make it Kodesh, to make it set apart. You know, I have heard many people throughout the various religions and cults that there are out there. And I have heard people make statements about the Sabbath. They have said, we don't have to keep the Sabbath. It's not important. These same people will emphasize what they want to call as holiness. And some of these people even speak like us. They might say the word Kodesh, for instance, and think that they are saying that they themselves are Kodesh, saying, hey, look, I am Kodesh, I teach these Kodesh things, but I do not believe or teach the Sabbath, because we do not have to teach or do the Sabbath. But what you must understand is that no man is Kodesh of his own. Any man that is set apart by YaHuWaH. How can a man be set apart? He chooses the things which YaHuWaH Himself chooses. He delights in the things which YaHuWaH Himself delights. The word commandment, in English, it has a rigid connotation. You think of, some hard task which you must perform. However, that word in the Hebrew is mitzvah. It gets its root from a word that means connection. YaHuWaH wants to have a connection with His people, and to have that proper connection and to allow Him to rain down endless barakoth in your life and to make the impossible possible in your life. You have to make the connection by observing His mitzvot. That means doing His commandments, and His commandments are not grievous. You cannot consider yourself Kodesh, or you could call yourself holy, because again, it's a pagan word. But if you use that word because you don't know any better, you don't know what it really means. You don't know that it means set apart or Kodesh. You don't know what these things mean. You could never be Kodesh, as what YaHuWaH would consider Kodesh, if you don't observe the Sabbath. It's impossible. It is impossible. Because YaHuWaH made it Kodesh. It is the first thing YaHuWaH made Kodesh. If you observe the first thing he made Kodesh, why would you observe anything else that he made Kodesh? And how could you think that you could please him if you would not choose what he chooses? Many people say, well, I have my own work. Well, YaHuWaH had his own work as well. The greatest work that brought you to existence. The greatest work that brought the waters that you drink and the foods that you eat, that gave you the space in which you live and the breath which you draw into your lungs. This is the working of Elohim, and yet his work being of the utmost importance. Set aside his work. Not so you had to observe some rigid commandments, but rather so that you could connect with him. So that you could connect and reflect him. You're made in his image and his likeness. He rested on the seventh day. He wants you to rest on the seventh day. How can you claim to have his spirit, his Ruach, inside of you, if you will not allow the Ruach to rest on the Sabbath day? Remember the Sabbath day to make it Kodesh, to make it set apart. 6 days you labor, you do your Avodah. That's your work, your hard labor. And you shall do all your Melachah. That's all of your business. But the seventh day, Yom HaShabbat, again, never called eighth day. How many witnesses have we read so far? Seventh day, seventh day, seventh day Sabbath, seventh day Sabbath. Perpetual count of the Shabuah. The seventh day is a Shabbat. A Shabbat of YaHuWaH, your Elohim. Remember, it's his Sabbath. He gives it as a gift. He baraked the Sabbath. He gave it as a gift. You do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days YaHuWaH made the Shemayim and the earth, the sea and all is in them, and rested the Yom HaShabbat, the seventh day. Therefore YaHuWaH barak, he gave as a gift the Shabbat Yom, and made it Kodesh. It is Kodesh. It does not matter what any Christian pastor may say, or what any other type of leader may say. If they try to speak against the Sabbath and say it is not to be done, remember YaHuWaH did not say. He said that it is Kodesh. It is Kodesh. It will always be Kodesh. And here we get beautiful insight into the Sabbath. You see, on the Sabbath day, if you observe the Sabbath day, even your animals are receiving part of the gift. Because in a house that observes the Sabbath, the donkeys do not work. The cows do no labor. The horses do no labor. No labor is done. They get to rest themselves. But in a home where the Sabbath is not done, then the animals work, and they probably work 7 days a week. In a home that keeps the Sabbath, you give as a gift by leading that home. If you are the father, or if you are in the position of the mother and you lead that home because there is no father, whatever you do, if you are the one who is instituting the Sabbath in your home, you are giving it as a gift to your offspring, to your children, if you have children. If you're instituting the Sabbath in your home, you could be giving the gift of the Sabbath to your spouse. Because instead of your wife working for you and slaving away for meals from you, or you making meals for her, vice versa, YaHuWaH has said, bake what you shall bake and cook what you shall cook. No cooking on the Sabbath. None of this work is done on the Sabbath. To do so is to break the Sabbath. To bake and to boil is to break the Sabbath. It is said not to do. No servantile labor. None of this type of work is done on the Sabbath. But if you institute the Sabbath in your home, you are not instituting a rigid command, but a mitzvah, a connection to YaHuWaH, the I am that I am, who sustains all through his power, through the word of his power. And by doing so, you give the precious gift of rest, ceasing from the labor to all who is in your home. Those who are weary and laden with heavy burdens, they get to rest from their works and take a break. What's so bad about that? You know that there's something spiritual about the Sabbath when you see people arguing about you taking a break. When they argue about taking a rest because the Creator who loves them wants them to rest and not to overexert themselves, and they argue and fight against it, you know that it is a spiritual matter. Because it is a spiritual day. Because every Sabbath that has ever been observed, YaHuWaH observed. He observed it. This next Sabbath that comes in your life, remember, you are keeping it because He is observing. He is also guarding it at that moment. In Exodus, Shemoth, in chapter 31, we're going to go to verse 13. Chapter 31, and we're going to read in verse 13. It says, "And you speak to Bnei Yisrael, the children of Yisrael, saying, my Sabbaths, my Sabbathot, you are to guard, you are to shamar, which means to watch over and guard diligently by all means. For it is an oath." The same exact word that was translated in it, as in the Sabbath, in the seventh day, He rested from all His work, in the King James. That same word which we said was oath earlier now appears as oath and is translated properly in almost all versions in the English because it is a sign. He says, my Sabbaths you are to guard by all means, for it is a sign. It is an oath. But when was it made an oath? In the beginning, in Bereshit. Between me and you throughout your generations. It is to always be a sign, a standing sign forever throughout your generations. To know that I, YaHuWaH, am setting you apart. He is making you Kodesh. Again, in the King James Version, they say, making you holy. How can you claim to have these attributes of being set apart and Kodesh and sanctified unto YaHuWaH Elohim if you do not observe the Sabbath, which He said, by doing the Sabbath, He is making you Kodesh. And you shall guard the Sabbath, for it is Kodesh to you. Everyone who profanes it shall certainly be put to death. For anyone who does work on it, that being shall be cut off from among his people. This implies not only will they die the death, but the spiritual life that YaHuWaH created inside you when He created you to be in the beginning, when He breathed into Adam, the living soul, as we say, the living being. That part of you will die if you do not observe the Sabbath. That is a harsh word for many people. How can this be? The Sabbath is so important. How can you say these things? Please continue watching this video and you will understand why this says it in the Torah. It is not because people are going to stone you. Yes, that's going to kill you the first time. YaHuWaH has to remove wickedness from amongst the people. But YaHuWaH is not just saying that. He's saying by extension of this breaking of the commandment, you sever the connection with me and with your people, and therefore you will die the death. Your spiritual being will die. 6 days work is done, and on the seventh is a Shabbat, Shabbaton, a Sabbath of rest. 6 days work is done, and on the seventh is a Shabbat of rest. Again, Shabbat, where we get it from Sheba, is identified again. The seventh with the Sabbath of rest. Set apart, O Kodesh LeYaHuWaH, set apart unto YaHuWaH. Everyone doing work on the Shabbat Yom shall certainly be put to death. Everyone who breaks the Sabbath day is going to die. And the children of Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, shall guard the Sabbath to perform the Sabbath throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant. Now, people who say that they have everlasting life, but do not believe that the Sabbath is to be kept as an everlasting covenant, you have a major problem upon your hand because the word everlasting is the same in both cases. Therefore, you must understand that this is a perpetual covenant, a perpetual count of 7. YaHuWah did not tell us to calculate it any other way, and to say any more or less is to add and take away from the word of YaHuWah, the great revelation of YaHuWah, the Torah. The children of Yasharel should guard the Sabbath. A lot of people read that and they say, well, see, we are exempt because we are not a part of the children of Yasharel. We are not ethnically of the 12 tribes of Yasharel, is what some may say when they read this. But what you must understand is this has nothing to do with ethnicity. This has nothing to do with ethnicity. If you read the Torah diligently, again you will understand that there were strangers, there were sojourners and foreigners from Mitzrayim who came out of Egypt. Mitzrayim, they came out with the children of Yasharel, and YaHuWah constantly says that there is one Torah for the stranger and one for the native of the land, that is the ethnic Yasharelite of the 12 tribes. But YaHuWah has called all of these people to the same commandment. When he gave the 10 commands, he did not tell the strangers and the foreigners to separate themselves. No, they were a part of the people of Yasharel. They were a part of the nation. Just like if you live in America and you have the proper papers, they will call you American, no matter the ethnicity. The same was so for Yasharel. So this was not just for the ethnic people of Yasharel. This was for all the strangers and the sojourners who would join themselves to YaHuWah. And we're going to read about the great barakah that YaHuWah is going to give to those who are of the nations who join themselves to YaHuWah and love His Sabbaths. In just a little bit, there is so much there. There are reasons for you to observe the Sabbath. Important reasons. Between me and the children of Yasharel, it is an oath forever, a sign forever. For in 6 days YaHuWah made the Shamayim, the heavens and the earth, and on Yom HaShabba'i he Shabbat and was refreshed. He rested and was refreshed. And when he had ended speaking with him on Mount Sinai or Sinai, he gave Moshe 2 tablets of the witness, tablets of stone, written with the very finger of Elohim. And twice we know that YaHuWah wrote these commands with his own finger. He wrote and signed the Sabbath with his name. It is of the utmost importance to understand the Sabbath. But what I want you to understand more so is that when he gave those 10 words, the very first of the words was not keep the Sabbath. The very first of those words was I am YaHuWaH. That is the greatest of the commands. That is the first command. He introduces who he is, and then he introduces how we should honor him by saying, you have no other Elohim before my face. You do not make any graven image or any likeness in the Shamayim or the heavens above, the earth beneath, the waters beneath the earth. You do not bow down to them. You do not serve them. For I, YaHuWah, your Elohim, am a jealous or territorial Elohim in your midst. You do not bring the name of YaHuWah, your Elohim, to nothing. And then he tells us that we should guard the Sabbath, to honor it, because it is Kodesh to YaHuWah. Why did I say that? Because YaHuWah wants you to know him first. He wants you to have a relationship with him first before you get carried away with the Sabbath. You know, when you first start to observe the Sabbath, you are going to most probably, make a few mistakes. That is why YaHuWah is there with his constant compassion, his chesed, his mercy, to give to you and to help you by revelation through his ruach, his wind and breath, how to properly observe his Sabbath. But what you must have in your heart first is a revelation of who he is. I know there are people out there who do not observe the Sabbath who will be listening to my voice. There are many of you who are struggling with not keeping the Sabbath. I don't want you to take from this video that I am preaching down to you or looking down on you as if I am somehow better than you because I observe the Shabbat, or that our people who observe the Shabbat are better than you. That is not what we are saying. We want you to see the beauty of the gift of the Sabbath, of the Shabbat. It is a gift. It is a gift to you. Embrace the gift of YaHuWaH and be Kodesh. Be set apart as He is Kodesh, as He has said in His Word. If you will keep the Sabbath, if you will keep the Sabbath, YaHuWaH will keep you. He will watch over you. He will protect you. In Shemoth, in Exodus 35 verse 1, and Moshe assembled all the congregation of the children of Yisrael and said to them, these are the words which YaHuWaH has commanded you to do. Work is done for 6 days, but on the 7th day, Yom HaShabbat, it shall be Kodesh to you. A Shabbat of rest, a Sabbath of rest to YaHuWaH. Anyone doing work on it is put to death. Do not kindle a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. YaHuWaH is telling us how to observe His Sabbath, that we do not kindle fires, we do not do these things on the Sabbath. And He is emphasizing that work is always done for 6 days in cycles of 7, that there will be 6 days of work and the 7th day will be a rest. Just like the children of Yisrael, they gathered bread for 6 days and on the 7th day there was none for 40 years. And never is there an example of any other way to calculate the Sabbath other than to count. A child can count to 7. It is very beautiful how simplistic this revelation is. In the scriptures, again, the number 7 is so important because it correlates to the 7-branched lampstand, which we call the menorah, which was in the house of YaHuWaH. It correlates to the week, the creation week, to the Sabbath. It correlates to the messengers, the 7 messengers before YaHuWaH's throne, which are called the 7 Rukot. It's so deep in the scriptures. And then in the secular world, in just normal everyday life, we see that there are 7 chords in a major scale. 7 is the number of a balanced pH. 7 is so important in this revelation. We have to understand that the Shabbat is always referred to as Yom HaShabbat. And for those out there who think they've come to a new revelation, and they think that it is somehow calculated by the moon because they read a few passages about our feast days and they got a little confused, understand that nowhere does YaHuWaH say that it is Yom HaShabbat Mekodesh, which means from the renewal of the moon. Never. Always it is identified simplistically as Yom HaShabbat. Whenever YaHuWaH wants you to calculate something from a moon cycle, He will say Mekodesh, which means from the renewal or from the new moon. Okay? This video is not to debunk these random theories and flavors of the month that are out there about the Sabbath being calculated by the moon or the intercalculation of a solar year and all these fantasies that people have concocted in their minds. This is not what this video is designed for. This video is designed rather for those who want to understand the depth and beauty of the Sabbath, the historical true Shabbat. And we're going to talk more about the historical Sabbath. Okay, now if we examine one of the festival days, because it is correlated and called a Sabbath. This day is called the Yom HaKippurim, which is the Day of Atonement or Atonements. And it is identified as a Sabbath. Remember earlier we read, surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, or my Shabbatot, which is plural, you shall keep by all means. You know, there are people out there that say, you know, that they keep YaHuWaH's Sabbaths because they keep the 7th day Sabbath. Yes, it's true. That is true. It is a Sabbath. But YaHuWaH has created other times that are called Shabbat, because the word Shabbat also means to rest and to cease from. Such as the Day of Atonement, Yom HaKippurim, in Leviticus, Vayikra, chapter 16, verse 29. It reads, and this shall be for you a law forever. Leolam. In the 7th month, again, this is important because now we're seeing Chodesh Shabbat, which is the 7th Kodesh, the 7th month, on the 10th of the month. So now again we see what I was speaking of earlier when I said if YaHuWaH wanted us to calculate the Sabbath, He would have said the 7th of the month. But He leaves off of the Kodesh. So to say that it has something to do with the month, the seventh-day Sabbath, is ridiculous. But this festival is calculated from the month, okay? It is the 10th of the month. It says, you shall afflict your beings and do no work, just like the Sabbath. The native or the stranger who sojourns among you, for on that yom he makes atonement for you to cleanse you, to be clean from all your sins before YaHuWaH. It is a Shabbat of Sabbaton, a Sabbath of rest for you, and you shall afflict your beings a law forever. Forever. Not just a law for those times, not just a law for those times plus the years in the future while the temple of YaHuWaH, the house of YaHuWaH, is on the earth, not just while the Israelites are in the promised land. Remember, they were keeping the Sabbath before they entered the promised land. There are people who say we can't keep the Sabbath because we are not in the promised land. But they were keeping the Sabbath in the wilderness. They were not even in the promised land. They kept it for 40 years before they entered the promised land. There are people who say that we must not observe the Sabbath because according to the Torah, there are specific sacrifices that are done on the Sabbath day. However, if you would study the Torah properly, you would see that the Tamid offerings, the standing perpetual offerings, which were done every morning and every evening, started at Har Sinai and Mount Sinai. The children of Yisrael had already been observing the Sabbath before they got to Mount Sinai, before the perpetual offerings were given day by day. The Sabbath offerings had not been kept yet at that point until they were instituted at Mount Sinai. So people say that we should not be observing the Sabbath because we're not in the land, or people say all these different things. We can't do these sacrifices, on and on and on. This is ridiculous talk when you truly study the Torah. This comes from obviously from those who do not properly study the scriptures. Also, if we look at another example of the seventh-day Sabbath in Vayikra, if we go to Leviticus, Vayikra, and also, if we look at another example of the Day of Atonement in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 23, in verse 32, it says, it is a Shabbat of rest to you, and you shall afflict your beings on the 9th day of the month. At evening, from evening to evening, you observe your Sabbath. Literally in the Hebrew, the Abrit, it says, Be'ereb, me'ereb ad ereb, which means in the evening, from the Arab unto the Arab. The word Arab means mixture and refers to the mixing of the light that you see over the horizon when the sun is setting, and the absence of light that comes from the night, and the mixture that happens between the two. Some people call this dusk, various things. This is called in the Hebrew the Arab, okay? And we are to keep the Yom Kippur as a Sabbath, and it says, from evening to evening, you observe your Sabbath. Now, also you have to understand that this is telling us that the Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonement, should be observed this way. From the evening of the 9th until the evening of the day, that will give you an entire 24-hour span of time, which is going to be a Sabbath, a Shabbat. But understand there are no commas and periods and things of that nature in the scriptures. So literally, the revelation of from evening to evening you observe your Sabbath stands not only for the Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonement, but also the seventh-day Sabbath. And this is just to emphasize the idea that the Sabbath truly is from evening to evening. Of course, there are many of you who know this. The only reason I bring these things up and emphasize them is because the day and the hour in which we live, and that there are many false teachers who are proclaiming erroneous doctrines concerning the Sabbath. In Leviticus YaHuWaH 24, 1 through 8, I'm not going to read this particular passage in this video. However, I would like for you to go and do a study on it. It's very interesting. It correlates the 7-branched lampstand with the Sabbath by the fact that it is arranged every 7 days, and by the fact that the showbread, the bread that would be in the house of YaHuWaH forever, perpetually, is put there on the Sabbath. And it represents the 12 tribes of Yasharel. There are 12 loaves. And it is correlated with the Sabbath, again, tying in the idea of bread with the Sabbath. And remember, in the Torah, YaHuWaH said that man shall not live off of bread alone, lechem alone, but by every single debar, every single word that proceeds from the mouth of YaHuWaH. In YaHuWaH 25, if you would read verses 1 through 21, when you have an opportunity. I'm going to summarize because of the length of the passage. But if you go and read, what you will read is that YaHuWaH says, when you come into the land. Now this is key for this particular revelation, because the children of Yasharel did not observe this during their time in the wilderness, but only when they came into the land. That they were to work their fields and work the land for 6 years, and on the 7th year they would not take anything that grew from their vineyards and from their trees and from their crops. They would not sow, they would not reap. How could this be possible? Many people think, well, they would starve. Well, YaHuWaH says that he would pour out the rain and he would give them enough crop. They would give him 3 times the crop on the 6th year. And on the 7th year, you would have plenty. You would have what you needed for the 7th year, and you would have what you needed for an additional year. You would have an abundance. You wouldn't have just enough like you would have on the Sabbath day for the manna. Like you only had a double portion on the 6th day, so that you just had enough for the Sabbath. But for the 6th year, because YaHuWaH knew that it would be hard for us to truly trust him without, gathering in of our own produce for an entire year, it would give us 3 times the amount. And we were to make this 7th year, again, Shabbat Shana, the 7th year, we were to make this a land Shabbat, a Shabbat for the land. And YaHuWaH says that if we would not allow the land to rest on the 7th year, that he would exile the children of Yasharel and send them to the 4 corners of the earth, and that he would send them to be servants to their enemies, so that the land could enjoy its Sabbaths. That's how important this revelation of the sevens, of the count of 7. How do we calculate the yearly Sabbath? Same way you do the weekly Sabbath. You count. Same way. Count to 7. It's very simplistic. If you continue to read in that chapter, you also read that just like you have to have 7 completed Sabbaths, and the morrow after gives you the Shavuot, what is called the Pentecost, the count of 50, just as that is done, there is also a 7 completed Sabbath years. And after a year after this would give you would have 49 years from 7 completed Sabbath years. You'd have, that's 7 times 7, that's 49. The next year gives you 50. This is the year of the Yobel, which is the Jubilee. And this is a time for the land to rest, a time for debts to be released, and all types of freedom. And it's called the acceptable year of YaHuWaH, the Yobel, the Jubilee, time of sounding the ram's horn and of rejoicing. But the reason that I'm introducing this concept, this doesn't have anything to do with the weekly Sabbath. The reason I'm introducing this idea is for something we are going to learn later in the video. So remember this. Remember, there is a 7-year Sabbath. Now, there are those who live in various lands like America and Europe and different things, and are wondering, how do we keep this Sabbath year? Well, first of all, you don't have to in a pagan land. That may surprise some people that, I would say this, but it's not me that is saying this. It is the word of YaHuWaH. They didn't keep it when they were in the wilderness. It says to keep it when you come into the land. Now, if you want to keep this, if you figured out, your own methods or whatever, and you want to try to observe these things, I have no issue. But just understand that from a truly Torah perspective, that the land Sabbath was for the land of Yasharel. When Yasharel would be sent into captivity, we know through historical records that when they could, they observed the weekly Sabbath, but they never observed a land Sabbath in pagan lands. This never happened. There's a reason for it. In Vayikra, Leviticus 26, verse 2, it says, guard my Sabbaths and reverence my Kodesh place. I am YaHuWaH. If you walk in my laws and guard my commands and shall do them, then I shall give you rain in its season, and the land shall yield its crops, and the trees of the field yield their fruit. Hallelujah. YaHuWaH is saying, if you would trust me, if you give it to me, if you do what I've asked you to do, then I will give you the rain. You have nothing to worry about. I will give you the rain. I will make your crops produce so that you can honor me. You do not have to worry about these trivial matters. You do not have to worry about these things. Just worry about my commands. Honor them. Honor those things that make me happy, is what YaHuWaH is telling us. If we will honor these things, He will give us the rain. Our land will yield its crops. The trees will yield their fruit. Leviticus, Vayikra 26:33 reads, this is talking about if you break the land Sabbath. Listen. And I shall scatter you among the nations or Gentiles and draw out a sword after you. This is how important the idea of the Sabbath and the land Sabbath is. And your land shall be desert and your cities ruins. And the land will enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies waste and you are in your enemy's land. Then the land would rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies waste, it rests. For the time it did not rest on your Sabbaths when you dwelt in it. That's how important this is. Let's go over to Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 15. We go to chapter 15. We're going to observe verse 29. For him who does whatever by mistake there is one Torah, both for him who is native among the children of Yasharel, and for the stranger who sojourns in their midst. But the being who does whatever defiantly, whether he is native or a stranger, he reviles YaHuWaH, and that being shall be cut off from among his people. Notice it doesn't just say for the Yahudim, for the Jews, or for the Yasharites, for the Israelites. It says for even the stranger, the sojourner, the foreigner who is in your midst. There is only one Torah. This completely destroys the idea of what the Jews, the Yahudim, have called the Noahide laws, saying that there are special laws for the Gentiles and special laws for the Yahudim, for Yasharel. This completely abolishes the idea of this. If you have joined yourself in covenant relationship with YaHuWaH Elohim, you and Yasharel, there is no difference between the law that is for you and for them. So when somebody says, well, I believe in the mighty one of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, but I do not keep his commandments because those are for the Jews or the Yahudi, then they have no understanding. No understanding whatsoever. One law. It says if you break the Sabbath defiantly, or any of his commandments defiantly, then you revile YaHuWaH. Because he has despised the word of YaHuWaH, he has broken his command against mitzvah, against its root and connection. He is saying, because you have despised the word of YaHuWaH, you have severed the connection. You broke the command. That being shall certainly be cut off. How can you live if you sever yourself from the self-existing one, the one who sustains you, the one who gives you life? If you cut yourself off from him, you have no life in yourself. That being shall certainly be cut off. His crookedness is upon him. And while the children of Yisrael were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moshe and to Aharon and to all the congregation, and they put him under guard because it had not been declared what should be done to him. And YaHuWaH said to Moshe, the man shall certainly be put to death. All the congregation stoning him with stones outside the camp. This is how important the Sabbath is. And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, as YaHuWaH commanded Moshe, and he died. And YaHuWaH spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Yisrael, and you shall say to them to make tzitzit on the corners of their garments throughout their generation, and to put a cord of blue in the tzitzit of the corners. And it shall be to you for a tzitzit, and you shall see it, and shall remember all the commands of YaHuWaH, and shall do them, and not search over your own heart and your own eyes, after which you went whoring. So that you remember, or zakar, make a memorial, and shall do all my commands, and be kodesh unto your Elohim. I am YaHuWaH your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Mizraim to be your Elohim. I am YaHuWaH your Elohim. YaHuWaH tells us that the man who is gathering sticks on the Sabbath day must be stoned to death. And many people read this and they think, whoa, this is hard, this is harsh. How could he require the stoning to death of a man who is simply gathering sticks? First, understand, for this man to be where he is today in this narrative, he crossed over the dry ground when YaHuWaH separated the sea, the Red Sea. Yom Suf. He walked over. He saw the fiery pillar. He saw the messenger of YaHuWaH. He was eating from the manna that rained down from the heavens that YaHuWaH gave, that spiritual bread. He drank from the rock that YaHuWaH split and gave the waters from the rock. He ate from the quail which YaHuWaH had brought forth. He saw the mighty power of YaHuWaH. He heard the voice of YaHuWaH at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, when YaHuWaH uttered the 10 commandments, the 10 words. And the 10 words were so powerful that the nation, the entire nation of Yisrael, says, no more, don't let Elohim speak to us. But you, Moshe, you, Moses, you go and speak to YaHuWaH, and whatever he tells you, that we will do. They were afraid when they heard his voice. This man heard that voice. He saw the great fire, and yet, he would do something so trivial and ridiculous as defy the word of YaHuWaH for some sticks on the Sabbath day. YaHuWaH is not mocked. He was cut off from his people. And because of this command, YaHuWaH gave us a fresh command, a new commandment, that the children of Yisrael were to tie in the corners of their garments tzitziot. The tzitzit is something like a tassel to some degree. And it is tied very different ways from some people, but what will always make the tzitzit special is the cord of blue. The color blue in the scriptures represents the great sapphire throne of YaHuWaH Elohim. It also represents the sky in which we identify as Shamayim. It also represents the commands of YaHuWaH, because we know that the commands were given on tablets of stone, and we know through historical truths that these stone tablets were sapphire. They were blue. That is why we were commanded to tie this corner of blue, and we know that it is written that the Son of Righteousness would come with healing in his wings. The wings are the corners of the garment. What is in the corners of the garment? The tzitzit. This passage is talking about the Messiah who is to come, that when he comes, that the very hem of his garment, the tzitziot, would bring about healing and restoration in people's lives. And surely we saw this to be true in the life of Yahushua HaMashiach, the Messiah. Now let us examine Bamidbar, Numbers, chapter 28, verse 9. We're going to look at the sacrifices that were to be done on the Sabbath day. It says that on the Sabbath day, 2 lambs a year old, perfect ones, and 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering mixed with oil and its drink offering. The burnt offering for every Shabbat, besides the continual burnt offering with its drink offering. So this shows us that indeed there were drink offerings of wine. This is why oftentimes, this is one of the many reasons why oftentimes on the Shabbat we make it special. It is called the Kodesh cup that we drink the wine from. It has been called in Aramaic Kiddush, but we say in Hebrew Kodesh. And for this reason also we break bread on the Sabbath day, literally, because we know that these precepts and observances were to be done forever. It says, an ephah of fine flour as grain offering mixed with oil with its drink offering. There are many more reasons why we do these things, but this is one of the many reasons. Also, in Devarim chapter 5, verse 12, reiterated again, in the 10 Commands, we see, guard the Sabbath day to make it Kodesh, as YaHuWaH, your Elohim, commanded you. 6 days you labor and shall do all your work, but the 7th day, Yom HaShavi'i, is the Shabbat. It always is the Shabbat. Of YaHuWaH your Elohim you do no work, you nor your son nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, so that your male servant and your female servant rest as you do. See, there's no class here. There's no hierarchical class. Even those who are seen as servants are to rest. If you think you can keep the Sabbath and make people work for you, you are wrong. Your servants must rest on the Sabbath day. It is your duty to give them the gift of the Sabbath so that we can reflect the giver of the Sabbath. And you shall zakar, or remember, that you were a slave in the land of Mitzrayim, which is synonymous with the concept of being a slave to sin and death. And that YaHuWaH Elohim brought you out from there by a strong yad, by a strong hand, and by an outstretched arm. Therefore YaHuWaH your Elohim commanded you to observe the Sabbath day, the Shabbat day. YaHuWaH our Elohim, He loves His people. He does not want His people to die. He wants His people to live. He tells us in the Torah, when we read about the Berakoth and the cursings, what are called the blessings and the cursings, we read that YaHuWaH says, I put before you life and death. Choose life. He wants us to choose life. The Sabbath is a picture of the world to come, the Shabbat that is to come, where YaHuWaH gives us the true eternal Sabbath so that we can find that true rest for our beings, for our nefesh, and for the ruach, the wind and breath, the spirit of YaHuWaH that dwells within us. Now, if we would go back to the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, in chapter 19, verse 1, just to re-emphasize. And YaHuWaH spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to all the congregation of the children of Yisrael, and say to them, be Kodesh, or be set apart, for I, YaHuWaH your Elohim, am set apart, or Kodesh. Each one of you should fear his mother and his father, and guard my Sabbaths. I am YaHuWaH your Elohim. Again, many people I have heard throughout the years quote this passage. They may say it in different ways. Some may say to be Kodesh, for I am Kodesh. Some may say, like for example, from the King James Version, it says, be ye holy, for I am holy. How can you claim to be set apart or special or sanctified and pure as this word Kodesh truly means? How could you truly claim what you call holiness? Not what we call holiness. That word has pagan connotation. But what they call holiness, how can you claim it if you do not keep the Sabbath? Because right here, it says specifically, be Kodesh, for I, YaHuWaH your Elohim, am Kodesh. Each one of you should fear his mother and father and guard my Sabbaths. This is how you become Kodesh. You guard his Sabbath. I am YaHuWaH your Elohim. In 1 Kepha, which is called Peter in the Christian world, it reads in chapter 1 verse 15, instead, as the one who called you is Kodesh, so you also should become Kodesh in all behavior.
because it has been written, Be Kodesh, for I am Kodesh. So right here, by quoting this passage in Vayikra Leviticus, Kifa is telling us how we are to be Kodesh for the one who is making us Kodesh, who is YaHuWaH. Because if he is quoting for the passage that tells us how to be Kodesh, and in the passage, if we go to reference what he's saying, he says, Be Kodesh, for I am Kodesh. Each one of you should fear his father and his mother and father, and guard my Sabbaths. I am YaHuWaH your Elohim. Hallelujah. This is very exciting because so many will be hearing this for the first time. I pray that your eyes are beginning to open, that your ears are beginning to open, that you're beginning to see that YaHuWaH gave the Shabbat as a sign, a Kodesh sign, forever. In Leviticus 19:30, guard my Sabbaths. Again, he says over and over and over, guard my Sabbaths, and reverence my Kodesh place. I am YaHuWaH. Now we looked at the Yom Kippur as a festival unto YaHuWaH briefly, and really quickly I want to look at the day that I referenced earlier called Shavuot, which is also called Pentecost, which means in Hebrew, Shavuot means weeks or sevens. Pentecost means a count of 50. This is how you calculate it. And from the morrow after the Sabbath, that means the first day of the week, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, we're going to talk about this very in depth when we get to the segment on Shavuot. And shall count for yourselves 7 completed Sabbaths. So you have to have 7 completed Sabbaths. That means the last day there has to be a Sabbath. Until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you count 50 days, and you shall bring a new grain offering to YaHuWaH. Today, on the Pharisees, they observe this quite differently than they did in the first century temple period. Because the very reading says here that you must count 7 completed Sabbaths, and the morrow after that final Sabbath is the 50th. So it's always going to, the 50th day will always be on the first day of the week. It's always going to work out that way. It's always going to give us the 7 completed weeks is going to be 49, the morrow after is 50. So if you have a calendar that requires you to do something other than that, then you're missing the mark. Because it tells us specifically, okay? You have to observe it this way. It is the Feast of Weeks, but we could call it the Feast of Sabbaths, because we have to have 7 completed Sabbaths. And using a lunar model for the Sabbath makes this utterly impossible and makes the whole idea of some lunar-based Sabbath for the weekly Sabbath as completely ridiculous. Again, this video is not to debunk that particular idea, but again, for those of you who maybe have read or thought or seen videos about it, the scriptures completely destroy that whole concept. Now take your minds back to what we were talking about a moment ago. We talked about the fact that YaHuWaH said, if you won't keep his land Sabbaths when you're in the land, he's going to draw a sword after you. He's going to chase you into the land of the nations, the Gentiles. They're going to rule over you, and he's going to allow his land to become desolate so that it could enjoy its land Sabbaths. And with that concept, an idea, let's go to Yirmiyahu, who's been called Jeremiah. And we're going to go to Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, chapter 17. And we're going to begin in verse 19. It reads, Thus YaHuWaH said to me, Go and stand in the gate of the children of the people, by which the sovereigns, the kings of Yehuda, come in, and by which they go out. And in all the gates of Jerusalem, and you shall say to them, Hear the Dabar YaHuWaH, the word of YaHuWaH, you sovereigns of Yehuda, all Yehuda, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem who enter by these gates. Thus said YaHuWaH, Guard yourselves and bear no burden on the Shabbat Yom, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem, nor take a burden out of your houses on the Shabbat Yom, nor do any work, and you shall set apart or make Kodesh the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. But they did not obey. The children of Yisrael, if you read historically throughout the scriptures, oftentimes turn their backs on the living Elohim to worship Baal, who is called Baal, the very word means Lord in the scriptures. Oftentimes they broke YaHuWaH's Sabbaths. That is why they were dispersed from their land. That's why their land became uninhabited. It says, but they did not obey or incline their ear. And they made their necks stiff not to hear and not to receive instruction. And it shall be if you diligently obey me, declares YaHuWaH, to bring in no burden through the gates of this city on the Shabbat Yom. And make the Shabbat Yom Kodesh, or set apart the Sabbath day, to do no work in it. Then sovereigns and heads or leaders, sitting on the throne of David, who is called David, shall enter in through the gates of the city, riding in chariots on horses, and they and their heads, the men of Yehuda, and the inhabitants of Yerushalayim. And this city shall be inhabited forever. And they shall come from the cities of Yehuda, and from the places around Yerushalayim, and from the land of Benjamin, and from the low country, and from the mountains, and from the south, bringing ascending offerings and slaughter offerings, grain offerings and incense, bringing offerings of praise to the house of YaHuWaH. But if you do not obey me to make the Sabbath day Kodesh, or to set it apart, and not to bear a burden when entering the gates of Yerushalayim on the Sabbath day, then I shall kindle a fire in its gates, listen closely, and it shall consume the palaces of Yerushalayim and not be quenched. People have said the Sabbath does not matter. They have not taken into consideration that YaHuWaH destroyed his own people because they would not hearken to his voice and keep his Sabbath. That he sent them into the northern tribes, went to the Assyrian captivity. For this reason, the southern tribes, and which Yirmiyahu is now prophesying to concerning what is about to transpire, would be sent into the province of Babel under the king Nebuchadnezzar. Why? Why was there bloodshed? Why did the house of YaHuWaH get destroyed? Why did these things transpire? Because YaHuWaH said that they broke his Sabbaths. So if you try to say that the Sabbaths are not to be observed, it is because you have no understanding. But what I want to do with this video is to give you the proper framework to have a better understanding, or binah. And with understanding, you use it in a very strategic fashion, and this will be called, this is what we call in English wisdom, in Hebrew we call chokhmah, and it literally means how you use your understanding. So now I'm giving you the building blocks so that you can make a wise decision concerning the Sabbath. In the book of Lamentations, Yirmiyahu, who's called Jeremiah, wrote the book of Lamentations. It's called Ikah in the Hebrew, in the Brit. In chapter 2, in verse 5, it reads, YaHuWaH has been like an enemy. He has swallowed up Yasharel. He has swallowed up all of her palaces. He has destroyed her strongholds, and he increases mourning and lamentation in the daughter of Yehuda. He has demolished his booth. That means his very house. Like a garden, he has destroyed his place of meeting. YaHuWaH has made the Moedim, the appointed times, and Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion, and despises sovereign and priest in his raging displeasure. Oh, what a horrible, horrible thing that happened. They would not listen, as Yirmiyahu had prophesied, and later as he wept, writing the Lamentations, which means the weepings. And he said that YaHuWaH had been like an enemy. He destroyed his people because they broke his Sabbath. The prophecy came true that he prophesied to the kings of Yehuda when they did not listen. And what a tragedy it was for those lives, the blood that was shed because they would not keep the Sabbath. Says that YaHuWaH made the Moedim and Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion. Now this is important because there's a few people, in these last days, a lot of people want to teach from the scriptures. So the scriptures teach that there should not be many teachers. but they, I don't know what their method of study is. Perhaps I'm thinking that they probably have some program or using some type of website or using PDF files from other people, and they're not actually reading and studying in the proper context. Because I've heard people say, see, the Sabbath was forgotten. Because it says that it was forgotten in Zion. But if you would just do a proper study, you would see that they were not forgotten altogether. This is a play on the language, and it's reading that they were not being kept in Zion. In other words, the weekly Sabbath was no longer remembered as being kept in Zion because they were not keeping it in Zion. Now they were taken as slaves and captives into Babylon. But how do we know that they still knew when the Sabbath day was? They didn't lose it altogether. All you have to do is read the book of Daniel, Daniel, who served under Nebuchadnezzar, who served under his son, who served under Darius. This Daniel had a complete understanding of all the times of YaHuWaH. He had a complete understanding of when the continual burnt offerings were to be done. We see it through his daily prayers. He prayed 3 times a day to memorialize the morning and the evening slaughter offering that happened continually each and every day. And he had complete revelation from YaHuWaH about these times and about the end of time. And he knew the Sabbath. He knew when these times were. This is why he was thrown in the lion's den, for observing the prayers that were done continually, day after day after day, and especially observed on the Sabbath day, to memorialize the offerings that were offered up in the house of YaHuWaH. They were not forgotten by his people. They knew when the Sabbath was. In YaShayahu, in Isaiah 56, YaShayahu says some of the most important things, some of the most amazing things about the Sabbath. He says in verse 1, in chapter 56, "Thus said YaHuWaH, guard right ruling and do righteousness, for near is my Yeshua, my deliverance, to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Happy is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who becomes strong in it, guarding the Sabbath, lest he profane it, and guarding his hand from doing any evil. And let not the son of the foreigner who has joined himself to YaHuWaH speak, saying, YaHuWaH has certainly separated me from his people." So if you are a son of the foreigner, you cannot say that you are separated from YaHuWaH's people. He says, do not let them say this. He says, do not let the foreigner who has joined himself to YaHuWaH speak, saying, YaHuWaH has certainly separated me from his people, nor let the eunuch say, look, I am a dry tree. For thus said YaHuWaH to the eunuchs who guard my Sabbathot, my Sabbaths, and have chosen what pleases me, and are holding on to my brit, my covenant. To them I shall give in my house and within my walls a place and a name better than that of sons and daughters. I give them an everlasting name that is not cut off. Also the sons of the foreigner who join themselves to YaHuWaH to serve him and to love the name of YaHuWaH, to be his servants, all who guard the Sabbath and not profane it, and are holding on to my covenant. Them I shall bring to my Kodesh mountain, and let them rejoice in my house of prayer, Beit Tefillah. Their ascending offerings and their slaughter offerings are accepted on my slaughter place, for my house is called a house of prayer, Beit Tefillah, for all the people. The Master YaHuWaH, who gathers the outcasts of Yisrael, declares, I gather still others to him besides those who are gathered to him. YaHuWaH is saying that when he gathers his people back to their land, that he is going to gather others. He's going to gather strangers and sojourners who have joined themselves to YaHuWaH. And it says to love the name of YaHuWaH. Listen to this. It says, and to love the name of YaHuWaH, to be his servants, all who guard the Sabbath. So how do you love the name of YaHuWaH? Well, guarding the Sabbath is a part of it. If you ever hear a teacher who uses the name of YaHuWaH and tries to elevate it and make it special, but yet diminishes from the Sabbath and tells the people not to observe the Sabbath, or that he himself does not, then they do not truly love the name of YaHuWaH. They love it in word, but they do not love it in deed. Because here we see it is synonymous. Loving the name of YaHuWaH is synonymous with keeping his Sabbaths. And if you are a stranger, if you're one of the nations, one of the Gentiles, and you join yourself to YaHuWaH, you will have a name in his house of prayer that is better than sons and daughters. This is a tried and true promise from the Debar YaHuWaH, the word of YaHuWaH. He has promised this, and it has not come to pass yet. This is speaking of the house of YaHuWaH that shall be built when the Messiah rules and reigns, and in that house your name will be better than that of any Israelite. It doesn't matter what tribe, because he says your name will be better than sons and daughters. Because YaHuWaH, he wants the esteem. He wants to prove in his righteous judgments that the nations, there were those of the nations who loved him. And they did love my name. YaHuWaH, in the Torah, if a person from another nation wanted to join YaHuWaH's people, it was very simple. All they had to do was love his name and keep his Sabbaths and honor his commandments and guard them. There would be one Torah for the native born and those who are a sojourner or a stranger or a foreigner. Hallelujah. YaHuWaH says that he is going to gather more to Yasharel, which gives us the great hope and promise that YaHuWaH is going to gather all of his people. No matter whether they are ethnically from the tribes of Yasharel or whether they are not. Whether they guard the Sabbath or not, or whether they love his name or not, is where it hinges. That's where it's going to be important. If you keep his Sabbath, then he's going to gather you with his people. If you don't keep the Sabbath, you are cut off from his people. It's very clear. Now, if we move onward, flip a couple of pages to Yeshayahu, Isaiah 58. And Yeshayahu gives us even more beautiful prophetic insights into the Sabbath. He tells us in verse 12, he says, "Those from among you shall build the old waste places. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. If you do turn back your foot from the Shabbat, from doing your pleasure on my Kodesh Yom, my Kodesh day, and shall call the Shabbat a delight, the Kodesh day of YaHuWaH esteemed, and shall esteem it, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Then you shall delight yourself in YaHuWaH, and I shall cause you to ride on the heights of the earth and feed you with the inheritance of Yaakov, your father. For the mouth of YaHuWaH has spoken." YaHuWaH has given an awesome promise through the mouth of Yeshayahu, the Nabi, the prophet. He has said that if we guard his Sabbaths, we will literally ride on the heights of the earth. Hallelujah. That means that there are barakot that are coming. There are gifts, what people have deemed blessings. Again, that means gifts that are coming to the observer of the Shabbat. That you will ride on the heights of the earth. That you will inherit the great esteem and inheritance of Yaakov, who is called Jacob and Yasharel or Israel. You will inherit the great wealth and esteem, and you will ride upon the high places. This is a promise, along with the other promise, that even the eunuchs and the strangers who keep the Sabbath will have an awesome name, a great and esteemed name in the house of prayer of YaHuWaH. Now let us observe another awesome and excellent promise from YaHuWaH Elohim through the mouth of Yeshayahu, who is called Isaiah. In chapter 66 and verse 22. "For as the new heavens, the new Shamaim, and the new earth that I make stand before me, declares YaHuWaH, so your seed and your name shall stand, and it shall be that from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh, not just some flesh, not just a few people, but all flesh shall come to worship before me, declares YaHuWaH. And they shall go forth and look upon the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me, for the worm shall not die, and their fire not be quenched, and they shall be repulsive to all flesh. There is so much that is happening here. First, I want you to go outside and to observe the heavens and the earth and tell me, has YaHuWaH created the new heavens and new earth yet? No, He hasn't. This is something that has not happened yet. The same heavens and the same earth exist today. But YaHuWaH says that in the future, when He creates the new heavens and the new earth, the Sabbath will still be observed. We do not see anywhere in Scripture ever a place that indicates the Sabbath was to not be observed any longer. But rather we see the exact opposite, that is to be observed and to be observed forever, and it is a sign that we are Kodesh unto YaHuWaH. And the new heavens and new earth, we will observe the Sabbath, but it goes on to say, we shall look upon the corpses of the men who transgressed against YaHuWaH. Their fire will not be quenched, and their worm shall not die. Oftentimes you will read the words of Yahushua in the Brit Hadashah, which is called the Renewed Covenant writings. And you will hear him speaking of the what is called Gehenna in English, but is literally Gen Hinnom, which is the valley of Hinnom. And that there will be a fire there. And he says that in that fire, that the fire will not be quenched and the worm will not die. Often he repeats this over and over. And many have thought previously that these were his own words. But he said, I have not come with my own words, but the words of him who sent me. So he is repeating the words of YaHuWaH, specifically relating to the observance of the Sabbath, that in the reign that is to come, those who did not observe the Sabbath, those who transgress His covenant, they will have a fire, they will be repulsive to all flesh, their worm shall not die, and we can parallel that to the book of Revelation chapter 14 verse 11. It reads, and the smoke of their torture goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night. What is that word for rest? Shabbat. They have no Shabbat, Yom or Lila, day or night. They never have a Sabbath. They never get a rest. Those worshiping the beast and his image, also if anyone receives the mark of the beast. And if we were to go on further to the prophet who has been called Ezekiel or Yehezekiel, and we read in chapter 20, we start in verse 13, but the house of Yasharel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my laws, and they rejected my right rulings, which if a man does, he shall live by them. And they greatly profaned my Sabbaths. Then I said I would pour out my wrath on them in the wilderness to consume them. But I acted for my name's sake, not to profane it before the nations, before whose eyes I had brought them out. And I myself also lifted my hand in an oath to them in the wilderness, not to bring them into the land which I have given them, flowing with milk and honey, the splendor of all lands, because they rejected my right rulings and did not walk in my laws, and they profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols. And my eye pardoned them from destroying them, and I did not make an end of them in the wilderness. And I said to the children in the wilderness, do not walk in the laws of your fathers, nor observe their rulings, nor defile yourselves with their idols. I am YaHuWaH your Elohim. Walk in my laws, and guard my right rulings, and do them. And set apart my Sabbaths, and they shall be an oath, a sign, Aleph Tau, between me and you, to know that I am YaHuWaH your Elohim. So the Sabbath is to prove who our Elohim is. When we keep the Sabbath, it proves that YaHuWaH is our Elohim. But the children rebelled against me. They did not walk in my laws and my right rulings. They did not guard to do them, which if a man does, he shall live by them. YaHuWaH is saying, if a man guards my Sabbaths and my commandments, he shall live by them, because of them. They They profaned my Sabbaths. So I resolved to pour out my wrath on them to complete my displeasure against them in the wilderness. But I held back my hand and acted for my name's sake. Yahuwah is always showing compassion and holding back and not destroying because of his great name's sake. Not to profane it before the eyes of the nations, before whose eyes I brought them out. Also I myself lifted my hand in an oath to those in the wilderness to scatter them among the nations and disperse them throughout the lands, because they had not done my right ruling, and they rejected my laws, and they profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were on their fathers' idols. And I also gave them up to laws that were not told, that were not good, and right rulings by which they would not live. And I defiled them by their own gifts as they passed all their firstborn through the fire, so that I might stun them, so that they know that I am YaHuWaH. What a powerful passage. YaHuWaH emphasizes his authority over his people by telling them over and over and over to observe his Sabbaths. And yet Ezekiel chapter 22. Verse 8, he says, you have despised that which is Kodesh to me, and you have profaned my Sabbaths. And Ezekiel 20, verse 26, just a few more verses later, he says, her priests have done violence to my teachings, and they have profaned my Kodesh matters, my set-apart matters. They have not made a distinguishing between the Kodesh or the set-apart and profane, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and the clean. And they have hidden their eyes from my Sabbathot, my Sabbaths, my Shabbatot. And I am profaned in their midst. In Ezekiel onward in chapter 23, verse 38, it reads, they also did this to me. They have defiled my Kodesh place on the same day, and they have profaned my Sabbaths. YaHuWaH says, when you profane my Sabbaths, you do this to him. You profane him. Now we know in the future, when the Mashiach comes and he is restored on the earth as the king, the conquering lion of Yehudah, that the following will come true that we are going to read in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 24. This is talking about when the sons of Zadok are going to be the Kohanim, the priests of Yahuwah, in the Mashiach, the Messiah's temple. And it says, and they are to stand as judges in a dispute, and judge it according to my right rulings, and they are to guard my Torah, that's my teachings, my Torah, and my laws in all my appointed festivals, and Kodesh, or make set apart, my Sabbaths. And Ezekiel 45 verse 17 reads, and on the prince, this is talking about the Messiah, are the burnt offerings and the grain offerings and drink offerings at the festival, the new moons and the Sabbaths, in all the appointed times of the house of Yasharel. He is to prepare the sin offering, and the grain offering, and the burnt offering, and the shalom offering, to make atonement for the house of Yasharel. And chapter 46 of Ezekiel reads, thus says Adonai YaHuWaH, the Master YaHuWaH, the gate of the inner courtyard facing east is shut 6 days of work, but on the Shabbat it is open, and on the Yom of the new moon it is open. And the prince shall enter by way of the porch of the gate from the outside, and he shall stand by that post. And the priest shall prepare his burnt offering and his shalom offering, and he shall bow himself at the threshold of the gate, and shall go out, but the gate is not shut until evening. Hallelujah. And the people of the land shall also bow themselves at the entrance to this gate before YaHuWaH, on the Shabbathot, the Sabbaths, and on the new moons. And the burnt offering which the prince brings to YaHuWaH on the Shabbat Yom is 6 lambs, perfect ones, and a ram, a perfect one. You see the offerings. There are more offerings that are going to be done when the Mashiach comes for the Sabbath than was done previously by the giving of the Torah. Verse 12 of the same chapter. And when the prince makes a spontaneous burnt offering or spontaneous shalom offering to YaHuWaH, the gate facing east shall be open for him. And he shall prepare his burnt offering and his shalom offering as he did on the Sabbath Yom. And he shall go out, and after he goes out, the gate shall be shut. This is the importance of the Sabbath. This is the importance of the Mashiach. This is the importance of YaHuWaH's word. All found in the scriptures. Now, let's fast forward a little bit. We were talking about the revelations that came from Yehezekiel. Yehezekiel is living during this time of the Babylonian captivity, when he receives this information, and when the children of Yehuda, the house of Yehuda, which is called Judah by many in English, when they came back to their land after this diaspora into the land of Babel, we read about how important the Sabbath is in Nehemiah, which is called Nehemiah in English, in chapter 13, verse 15. And the text reads, "In those days I saw in Yehuda those treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves, and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, and figs, and all kinds of burdens which they brought into Jerusalem on the Shabbat Yom. So I warned them on that day that they sold food. And men of sword dwelt there, bringing in fish and all kinds of goods, and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Yehuda and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Yehuda and said to them, What evil matter is this that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our Elohim brought all this evil on us and on the city? Yet you bring added wrath on Yasharel by profaning the Shabbat. And it came to be when the gates of Jerusalem were shaded before the Sabbath, that I commanded the doors to be shut." Now, I just want to focus right there on this little phrase real quick. It says in Hebrew, "Wayahi," and it came to be ke'asher, for that selelu, the shadowing of darkness, sha'era, gates of Jerusalem, lifnei, to the face of the Sabbath, HaShabbat. In other words, it is saying that as the shadowing of darkness, the selelu, comes on the sha'era, the gates of Jerusalem, and then it says lefnei, to the face of the Sabbath. So as it is getting dark, as the shadowing is hitting the gates, it calls this time period the lefnei haShabbat, unto the face of the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath is now coming in as the Arab is approaching, because we keep our Sabbaths from evening to evening. But further, if we continue to read, I'll just reread that again. "It came to be when the gates of Jerusalem were shaded before the Sabbath," or to the face of the Sabbath, "that I commanded the doors to be shut, and commanded that they should not be opened till after the Shabbat. And I stationed some of my servants at the gate, so that no burden would be brought in on the Sabbath day. And the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares spent the night outside Jerusalem once or twice. And I warned them and said to them, Why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do it again, I lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath." You see how important the Sabbath day is? He says, if you keep on spending the night outside this wall, trying to get our people who were just cursed and rebuked by YaHuWaH and sent out of our land and all the desolation that happened, if you keep on trying to make us break the Sabbath, I'm going to lay hands on you. That's righteous anger. That's righteous anger from YaHuWaH through his servant. He says he's going to lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites, the tribe of Levi, that they should cleanse themselves, and they should come guarding the gates to set apart the Sabbath day, to make it Kodesh. Remember me, O my Elohim, concerning this also, and pardon me according to the greatness of your chesed, of your loving kindness, your loving commitment. You see how important the history of the Sabbath is. Now we have just observed a brief history. We didn't go through all the verses. We went through a lot of them to emphasize the importance and relevance of each and every aspect of the Shabbat. But we see the history of the Shabbat throughout the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketubim, throughout what is called the Tanakh, the Torah, and the prophets, and the writings that people have called the Old Testament erroneously. And you see that the Sabbath is always mentioned to be a special sign. It is always on the seventh day. It is from evening to evening. It must be observed in this fashion. And if not, YaHuWaH will bring out the sword on his own people. He will scatter them into the foreign lands. He will make them servants of pagan kings. Why? Because they did not choose what he chose. They did not choose to delight in what he delighted in. They did not choose what was Kodesh unto their Elohim. The Sabbath is a Kodesh oath, a Kodesh sign forever.
Today I give all that